What's going on, YouTube friends? Today I'm going to be going over a couple basic maintenance procedures on the B7, and we're going to start by doing the cam follower and checking it for wear. If it needs to be replaced, we'll put a new one in. After we check that, we'll go ahead and we'll pull out the plugs, see what the plugs look like. I just put the plugs in, so I doubt mine are bad, but I'm going to show you how to pull them out, gap them, put them back in, and torque them down to spec. This is just the way I do it, and you might have a different way of doing it, but I'm just showing everybody how I do the maintenance on these things. So hope you guys enjoy the video, and let's jump to it. Alright, so the first step we're going to do before we take out the high pressure fuel pump to check the cam follower is we're going to pull the fuel pump fuse. So the fuel pump fuse is going to be all the way in the left row of fuses, and it's going to be the third one up. You're going to pull this one and start the car and let it idle until it dies, and that lets all the fuel pressure out. And once it dies, pull your key out, disconnect the negative terminal on the battery, and we'll get to the next part. So I got my negative terminal off my battery just to make sure there's no power going to any electrical connectors I'm about to take off. The first hose you're going to take off is the supply hose to the pump. Yours is going to be over here somewhere by the intake, and use a 15 and a 17. A 15 goes on the small male end, and 17 goes on the female end. And you're just going to loosen that up, put a rag under it to catch all the fuel that's going to come out. There might be a little still in the line, and get that hose up. And what I usually do is I usually pull it up here by the flywheel. Obviously I got mine ran in a different place because of my setup, but I just pull it up out of the way to get away from the high pressure fuel pump and zip tie it out of the way. And then we're just going to go ahead and get all the electrical connectors off the pump itself, and get those out of the way. And this vacuum hose back here as well, that goes to the brake booster, and then it goes into the vacuum pump in the back. And I ain't got a clip on mine, but if you got a clip, you probably got to cut it off. It's probably one of those crimped clips. You cut that off, and you can put a new one back on it, just like a regular flathead hose clamp. Alright, we'll get this pulled off, get it out of the way, and continue on to the next part. Alright, so now that you got your low pressure line disconnected, you're going to have a little mounting bracket on the side of here somewhere. It's going to be a 10 mil to take that off. You're going to want to take that mounting bracket that your low pressure line goes into and get that right out of the way. Then the next line I take off is the high pressure line, which is a 17. You got to use it. It's a lot easier to get a stubby in here. I actually use 11/16 stubby. That way it gives me a little bit of play to kind of maneuver it around. I just find it easier that way. So yeah, we're gonna get that one taken off, and then we'll follow up with the low pressure line. And these clamps can sometimes be in a bad spot, and what I recommend doing is putting a regular hose clamp on it when you get them off. That way you can position it however you want, and the hose clamps are a lot easier to take off. Also, when you get the low pressure line off, check it for damage on the ends, because sometimes they get scarred up after a while after trying to take them off with like a screwdriver and whatnot. So yeah, we'll get this get these two lines out of the way and continue from there. Alright, I got these two lines down here loosened up, and the low pressure line, I found it a lot easier to get the pump out and pull it off that low pressure line. But our next step is we're going to take this little cap off the bleeder back here, and this one's going to be a 13 mil, and we're going to take this bleeder right off. And twist it out of the way. Pull it right off there. It's gonna drip out a little fuel. That's why I put another rag down there. And our T30 is gonna be the 3 bolts that hold the pump in. The reason why you got to take that bleeder off is because the T30 is kind of under it. Alright, so I got my 3 T30s out that mount the high pressure fuel pump to the adjuster housing in the back. And I forgot to say, if you might have a banjo bolt on the low pressure line, and I don't know the exact size of those. I've never had one. So that you'd have to figure that one out for yourself. But now we're just going to wiggle the pump on out of here, pull the piston out, and this is the little trick for the low pressure line. Is I'm just going to spin the pump around this line a couple times and kind of pull up on it and spin at the same time. Then it just pops out. And there it is. Yeah, everything on the pump looks good. I actually just replaced this O-ring not that long ago. Now let's pull the follower out. And there's the cam follower. Now mine's in good shape, so I'm not going to replace it. If this black coating on the front rubs off, I recommend you replace it right away. That way you don't get no damage to your cam or your high pressure fuel pump. But so when you go put this back in, put a little bit of oil on the tip of it, and probably pull a little bit of oil out of the motor itself. Just oil it back up before you stick it in, and you just drop the cam follower back into the slot and do everything in reverse order to put it back together. So when you go to put your bolts back in, the 3 bolts that hold the fuel pump to the housing, you're going to torque these to 10 Newton meters. That's the actual torque spec on them. And when I tighten them, I kind of do a couple turns on each one all the way around. That way it goes nice and evenly into that O-ring. So these two lines for the low pressure line, it's actually a 14 and a 17. I've always used a 15, never had a problem, but the actual size is a 14. And we're just gonna plug it all back in. The low pressure sensor and the high pressure side are the two connectors. And we'll get the hose for the vacuum pump to the brake booster plug back in. Don't forget to take your rag out, and that's how you do that. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and check our spark plugs. So if you're replacing these, you're going to have two little Torx here. I believe they're either a 15 or a T20, one of the two. I can't remember. And you're going to unclip all your coil packs. And pull your harness out of the way. Go ahead and pull these out. They pull straight up. If your boots are sticking, you just got to pull a little harder to get them out. And what I use, I actually don't have a spark plug socket, but I use a 16 on extension. Get her down there, break her loose. Completely unthreaded, and I stick a magnet down in there and pull the plug out. Like I said, I just replaced mine, so I know they're good. Alright, so if you're putting a new plug in, I know they come pre-gap, but I always recommend checking the gap. And of course, we're going to talk about gaps for a minute, because I'm just going to tell you the best experience I've had. When I was on pump gas, I always ran a 0.026 spark plug gap on the BKR7 EIXs, the Iridium plugs. I've had the best luck with the Iridium plugs, and these are one step cooler. But yeah, get whatever you use, a feeler gauge, or if you use one of the regular ones that you get from like the parts store, then I prefer the feeler gauges. They're just easier for me. Stick it in there, make sure there's no play, and check your gap, make sure your gap's right. Then I think the stock plugs, I think they're 0.032. If you're tuned, of course, you're going to want to run like a 0.028 if you're running pump gas. I'm on ethanol, and I'm running a 0.22, and I found the 0.22 runs really good with ethanol in these colder plugs. And I also have the upgraded coil packs from Ignition Products. So I just found the 0.022 is the best gap for this setup I have. And I get a lot of questions about these. I highly recommend the Ignition Products. You can notice a difference right off the rip. So when I go to put my plug back in, what I'm going to do, since I don't have a spark plug socket, I'm going to stick it in there and slide it down as far as I can. I'm trying not to mess up the gap as I drop it, so I just get it down there and I set it down to the bottom. Try not to drop it. I take my wrench, get it back down in there. Get her all the way tight. And when you torque these, don't just guess. Torque them the right way. So when you get your plug in, don't guess on these. Torque them down the way they're supposed to be torqued. When I get brand new plugs that haven't been torqued, I torque them to 22 foot-pounds. If I'm pulling them out, checking them, putting them back in, and they've already been torqued once, I torque them to 26. It's because that torquing ring on the bottom's already been crushed. So with your coil packs, always recommend it every time you pull them out, put dielectric grease back into the boot before you shove them back on. That way your boots don't stick to the plugs, and if you don't use it, your boot can eventually melt to the top of the plug. Then you got to rip the boot, and it damages the coil pack, and you got to stick some long needle nose pliers in there, pull the rest of the boot off the plug before you can get the plug out. And we got them in. We just do reverse process, put them back in, clip them all up, and you're gonna put your 2 little bolts back in if you got stop valve cover, and those get torqued to 5 Newton meters, and your spark plugs are changed. So I just wanted to touch base a little bit on spark plug gapping. Of course, I always recommend you get with your tuner and see what he recommends. Like I said, this is just the experience I've done and I've had with my car. And like I said, of course, more boost you run, you want a smaller gap, you'll blow out spark and you'll start missing in your top end. So just experiment with your plugs and see what your tuner says. But I found the 0.022 gap with the coils I have and the boost I'm running is good. So